This is a video walkthrough for the LeapMotion and processing assignment called Hands and Fingers. First thing we got to do is open it up, and I should note it is important that we're using processing 2 for this assignment. At the time of this video there's a version 3, but we don't want to use that. So go ahead and open up your sketch, Hands and Fingers. Be sure your LeapMotion is plugged in and your green light is on. And let's take a look at what we've got here. So before we start, this is very important, we need to import the LeapMotion for processing library. This is going to allow our LeapMotion to communicate with processing. To do that, open up Sketch, click on Import Library, and Add Library. Under our search bar, we're going to type LeapMotion, and the first one you see here, LeapMotion for Processing by Mr. Darius. Go ahead and install that one, and once that's done, we are ready to start. So you'll see here at the top of the file there's a few objectives we're going to get done. There's one more thing to do here. I'm going to go ahead and copy this hand.draw. We'll use that here in a second. But let's talk about how this sketch is structured and how you're going to use processing to get these objectives done. So in these objectives, we're going to add some shapes, attach some shapes to your fingers, move them around, change some colors. What you'll see underneath that are some shape templates I've included for you. This will make things a little easier for you when you're putting shapes in there. And we'll talk about each of these properties and what they're doing here in a little bit. Underneath that, you'll see some location hints. When we're moving some things around the screen, these will come in handy, and we'll get to that. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of a sketch before we start changing some things. Some of this will be familiar, some of it's going to be a little bit new if you've taken programming classes already. First thing you'll see here is your instance variables, right? Just like when you're making a class, we're going to declare them but not initialize them. That's the purpose of a constructor, is to initialize your instance variables, and that's what we see here. Instead of a constructor in the Java sense, we've got a method called setup. And what this does is it sets up your sketch with the dimensions and renderer that we'll be using. We set the background color, and we initialize in the instance variables. In this case, we're using a LeapMotion object. This is the object we're going to use to communicate with the LeapMotion. Underneath setup, right, we've got another method called draw, and these are generally your two most important methods in any sketch, right? So your setup is run only once. When you start the sketch, setup is run. It sets up your canvas, sets up anything else that you've put in here. It's not just limited to size and backgrounds. And then after that, the draw method is run consecutively. And this is dependent on your frame rate. So let's say, for example, you can manually set your frame rate in setup. And if your frame rate would be, say, 30 frames per second, your draw method will be called 30 times per second, so once for each frame that's rendering to your canvas. I don't recall what the default is, so we don't have to mess with that. Just know that draws run several times in a second. So in draw, it's important to note that what's run here runs from top to bottom in order, and the order in which we put things can matter a lot. And that's something you'll see when we get into some of these objectives. So let's take a look at what we're doing in draw. Very first thing we do is we set the background color. Now the format for background, you see just 255 here. You'll be familiar with this format if you've gone into HTML or CSS. 255 here is the same as saying 255, 255, 255, right? These are your red, green, and blue values. If we've got all of them at 255, this is representative of the same thing. The color you see here is white. If you've got 0 and 0, 0, it's all going to be black, and any combination in between. So you may notice we're setting the background twice, right? We set it once here and once in your setup. Now what's the difference? Well, remember we said that the setup runs once. This is what's done initially, and then every time we call the draw, right? I think the default may be 30 frames a second. So 30 times a second, we're refreshing the background. You'll understand why we do that here in a little bit. Some of our objectives will illustrate why we do that. Just know that the first thing we do every time a draw is called is set the background. Now, past that, I've done some framework for you already. This is how we're going to access hands and fingers and get all that drawn onto the canvas. What you'll see here is a for loop, right? It's an enhanced for loop. So what we're saying is for every hand object that we're going to call hand inside of our Leap objects get hands method, we're going to do this. Now this method extends through to the bottom of your sketch, which means if there are no hands present, none of this runs. If there are 2 hands present, this for loop will run twice, right? One for each hand. If there's 3 hands or 4 hands, you get the idea. Now, what you see directly after this isn't incredibly important to what we're doing here today, but it is good to know. So what we're doing is we're setting up some variables based on information we're getting from the hands objects. And now remember, hands are coming from our Leap object as an array, or probably an array inside of the get hands method. We're setting up positions, we're setting up movement. This is all sort of a behind the scenes stuff, but I've put it all here so that you can see what's going on and maybe get an idea for how this is being run in the background. We also assign fingers per hand. So for the first hand that's present, we get a list of fingers. For the second hand that's present, we get another list of fingers. After this, there's a drawing section. We'll be putting some stuff in here. And inside of the hands enhanced for loop, you'll see that we have a finger enhanced for loop. So for each hand that's present, and for each finger that's present on each hand, we'll be doing some things. Here's some framework in the background that you can use to get various attributes from each of your fingers. We'll be using get position, for example, here in a little bit, and you'll see here that we have a switch case. Now we'll break this down in a little bit, but know that each case represents a single finger, right? So when a finger is present, get type will return 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on the type of finger that's available. And you see with some comments here, each of these cases represents a unique finger. And like I said, we'll get into that here in a little bit. There's also a touch emulation, which means the distance from the screen, or more specifically, the distance, depth distance across your LeapMotion, right? So if your hands are closer to you, or directly over the LeapMotion, or further across the LeapMotion, this is what your cases represent. We'll get into that. So let's go ahead and come back up here to the top and take a look at some of these objectives and see if we can't do some fun things with this LeapMotion. First things first, we want to take this hand.draw, copy it, and what we're going to do is place it right down here in the drawing section. Now tabs aren't super important here, but I like to keep things tidy. So what this is going to do is, remember the location we're at. For each hand, we're going to draw it. Now these are all things built into your LeapMotion library, so we don't have to worry about what's going on behind the scenes. Just know that for each hand, we're going to draw it. Let's go ahead and test this out. Hit run. You should see your canvas, right? And this is what we're seeing in our setup, right? Our dimensions are 1024 by 768. We've got a white background. Now, When each hand is drawn, we should see them represented as wireframes. You can play around with this a little bit. There's some neat information there. Your fingers are labeled, and there's some other information on there about each hand, time visible. There's even a representation of grab strength, how closed is your hand. If your finger is being extended, you'll see that finger is highlighted in black, and it's also represented as an integer above each hand under outstretched fingers. Now, once you have this working, we're ready to knock out some of these objectives. Go ahead and close this window, and let's look at the very first objective. First one is add a red rectangle with a dark red border to the center of the screen. Now, to do this, we want to do this regardless of whether or not a hand is present. We just want it to show up in the middle of the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this right under the background, so that every time draw is called, we get a fresh background, and we're going to put in a fresh rectangle right here. Now, grab one of these presets I've made for you. We're just going to copy that and toss it in right here under background. Don't need that, but we've got some properties here that I'd like to go over with you while I get it sort of straightened out. Alright, so rectangle mode, this represents where the quote-unquote center of your rectangle is going to be located. When we say center here, it means that the position we give this will be oriented to the center of your rectangle object. And this is in contrast to, say, using one of the corners as the location, right? So if we give it, say, 1 and then 1, the center of your rectangle will be at position 1, 1. This we can leave alone. Stroke weight, if any of you are into digital media, you may recognize this terminology. This is going to tell processing how thick you want your lines to be. And when we say lines, I mean specifically your border lines, right? So in this case, we're just going to give it, I don't know, let's start with 5. It's not too big. This is going to be your stroke color, and in the objective we needed a dark red border, right? Regular red rectangle, dark red border. So I'm going to put in here, wonder if we can show line numbers. This might help. Maybe not. All right, maybe next time. So under your rectangle mode, stroke weight, we've got stroke color. We want a dark red, so I'm going to go with, let's say, 150, 0, and 0, right? So a full 255 under the red would give us a solid red. Any number lower than that will give us a darker red, closer and closer to black. So this should give us a nice dark red color. Under the fill, now this is going to be your rectangle fill color. You'll notice one of these is in RGB, one of these is in hex. They are interchangeable. We could do hex here, RGB here, doesn't matter. I just wanted to give you guys an example of both. So in this case, we want a red. We're going to use FF0000. In hex, again, if you've taken digital media, this may be familiar. On a base 8, base 16, yeah, base 16, we've got red, green, blue. If we max out our red, this is going to be 255, which should give us a nice bright red. Now we want to put in the rectangle position, and I've got labels for what each of these spaces do. We've got our X position, Y position, and remember this is going to be the center of our rectangle. We've also got the width and height of our rectangle. So let's refer back up to the top where we've got our location hints. Center of the screen is what we're looking for, right? On objective 1, we want a rectangle in the center of the screen. So let's use this guy right here, height and width both divided by 2. Copy that, and we're going to post these right back in here. Now what this is doing is height is a value kept in processing, same as width, and those are represented by your height and width of your canvas. So if we want it in the center, we can divide the height by 2, which should give us halfway up, and we can divide the width by 2, which should give us halfway across. This represents the center point of the screen. Now how wide and how high do we want this? Let's start with, I don't know, let's go with 100 for both. Or if this is a rectangle, I guess we should do, let's do 50 high, and let's do 100 across. Feel pretty good about that. Let's double check. Add a red rectangle with a dark red border to the center of the screen. Let's give it a go. Alright. So, not quite in the middle of the screen, but our border is good, and our color is good. Let's see if I can figure it out. So X position, Y position, this is important, and I think this is where we messed up. Our X position has to go first, along with our width. Our X position should be width, so we just have to swap these around. Width and height, we want this to be 100 across and 50 tall. Let's try that again. Looking good. Okay, so objective 1 is done. If you've got this far, we're looking good. All right, let's close that. Let's look at number 2. We want to make a red circle with a black border appear over your index finger. Now, placing your shape in a different space is going to matter, and remember that this is happening sequentially, top to bottom. So we draw a background, we draw a rectangle. Doesn't matter if your hands or fingers are in view of the LeapMotion, this will always be drawn directly after a new background. Now, in order to get a circle with a black border to appear over your index finger, we're going to move to a different part of this sketch. And the place we're going to move to is going to be inside our enhanced for loop for hands. So we know that a hand is going to be present, and in fact we know that a finger is going to be present because we want this to appear over our index finger. Now look inside of your switch. We're going to look at our index finger. So remember, for every finger we're going to go through this, right? Typically, I guess not everyone has 5 fingers, but most of us have 5 fingers. So your for loop is going to go through 5 times, once for each finger. Every time this goes through, we're going to see a different case, right? So the first time this runs through, what we get here is an integer return from getType that starts with 0. Then it goes to 1, then it goes to 2, then it goes to 3 and 4. So every time we go through this, it's going to run through one of these catches. So first time is a thumb, second time we go through is index, third time is middle finger, and on through the rest of the hand. Now if we want this into our index finger, that means any time that the getType returns a 1, we want to draw something. So we'll put in our circle here. Let's look at what we need. We want a red circle with a black border over our index finger. So we're going to take the circle preset, red circle, black border, yeah. And let's put this in our index finger. Make sure and get rid of your comments. And same deal. Stroke weight is going to be the width of your outline in pixels. We're going to stick with 5. I like the way that looks. We do 5? Yeah. stroke, remember we want this to be black, so we are going to stick with 0, which is the same as 0-0-0, but we don't have to draw all that, or we don't have to write all that in, so let's just stick with 0, representing black. Our fill color needs to be red, just like our rectangle. So our fill color is going to be FF0000 for red, green, and blue. Be sure you keep that pound symbol in there. Now the position is a little bit different, right? We know we want width and height, and this is going to be a circle. So let's stick with, let's go with 50. 50 wide, 50 high, since we don't need an oval. But what about position, right? How do we know where the finger is? Well, this is going to come back to this variable right here. We've got a finger position that's gotten from each finger. Now, for this particular finger, how do we get that position? Well, I've included some location hints up here. For the finger position, we just call finger.getPosition.x for our x position, and the same for our y position. So I'm going to copy these guys and post them right back in here. So we're getting our x position and our y position of our index finger. Fortunately, this works out to be the end of our finger. Looks like we've got everything in here. Let's go ahead and give it a shot. So our rectangle is still there. We know this is going to show up regardless of whether our hand's there. When you move your hand in, you should see that anytime that there's a finger, an index finger, it attaches a circle to that. And that can be moved around regardless of extension or hand, right? So anytime there's an index finger, we see a circle. Awesome. Looking good. All right, on to number 3. Make the rectangle appear only when your hand is on the stage. Now this is going to illustrate a little better about why we place this up here and where we're going to move it. So just to review, we know that this rectangle is going to show up regardless of whether or not there's a hand on the screen, right? What we want to do is move this. So what I'm going to do is cut out, whoops, we need to cut out the whole rectangle, and we're going to move it. Where do we want to move it? We want to move it under our drawing section. Why do we move it here? Because for each hand that's drawn, do everything here. And in this case, we're going to draw a hand when it's present, and we're going to draw a rectangle when a hand is present. Let's test this. Looking good so far. No hands present. We don't want to see the rectangle. We move the hand in, and we see a rectangle. Now, why does it disappear? Remember that every time a frame is drawn, we get a new white background that overlaps any previous background drawn or any other objects being drawn. So this is how we get a rectangle to show up or an object to show up only when a hand is present. Not so bad, huh? All right, we've done 3. Next thing we want to do is change the background color when you are in the hovering zone. All right, this is going to touch on the zone emulation or touch emulation, right? We're talking about zones. So what we want to do is change the background color when you are in the hovering zone. So let's head down to the hovering zone, which is going to be this guy right here. Now you may see that there's a little bit of feedback here, and I'll show you where that's coming from or where that's going. As a matter of fact, you can see this from my previous run. You'll see hovering present here along with a number. What we're seeing here is finger ID and then touch distance. So this is how your LeapMotion represents touch distance. What do we need in here? We need a background. We want to change the background color. So let's add background. We're going to do this with red, green and blue. Don't forget your semicolons. And what color do we want to make this? Let's say in hovering, let's go with yellow. So how do we get yellow? We need red, and well, let's think about our digital media. Cyan, yellow, magenta. So we take away green? I don't remember. Well, whatever color we get, we'll just go with it. We've added background to hovering. Let's see what we get. Hey, we got purple. That's totally not what I wanted, but we changed the background when we're in a particular zone. So now my hand is a bit closer to the screen. I move it back into our hovering zone, and then back again to our closest zone. So you'll see that only in the middle we see purple. And we're going to change that because I'm not a big fan of purple. We're going to go with green. Of course, you can make whatever color you want. If you like purple, you can stick with that. Now you'll also see our touch distance. Let's see, what's next? We've got change the background color when you are in the touching zone. So, same thing as we did before, except we're going to have a different color when we're in the touching zone. Of course, you can pick any color you want. I'm going to go with blue this time. Don't forget your semicolon. So in hovering, we're going to see green. In touching, we're going to see blue. Let's give it a shot. So I've got my closest zone. It's kind of small, so you may have to take a couple of tries to see it. Our hovering zone is green, and our touching zone is blue. You can change these by moving your hand closer to or further away across your LeapMotion, or closer to and farther away from your screen. Now, last one, make the rectangle show regardless of the background color change. Now remember, we talked about doing this draw method, or running this draw method top to bottom. So why is the color overriding our hands? How do we get that rectangle to show up regardless of where it shows up? Well, in order to get this rectangle to show up, we know we're going to need to move it. So let's go ahead and cut this whole thing out and think a little bit about where we want to move it. So top to bottom, each time draw is done, we draw a new background, white. We draw a hand. We draw a circle over fingers, and then we redraw the background depending on where our touch emulation is. So in this case, we want it to show up regardless of where our hand is. That means that the very last thing that we need to show up, or the very last thing we need to draw on our canvas, is going to be a rectangle, which means we need to put a rectangle not only in hovering, but also inside touching. And you want to be sure that this is taking place after you redraw the background. You don't have to get your tabs straightened out. I just like to make it look nice. So let's review what we just did. The very last part of this sketch has to do with touch emulation. When we're hovering, it redraws the background green. On top of that green background, we're going to draw a rectangle. Same thing for touching. If we're in the touching zone, we're going to change the background to blue and then draw a rectangle on top of that. So layers wise, think Photoshop or GIMP or Illustrator, any of your drawing programs. The very first thing you draw is going to be your bottom layer. In this case, our white background, and then we just stack layers on top of that as they're being drawn. So we draw a hand on top of that white background, we draw circles on top of that hand, and down here we're going to draw a background on top of the circles, on top of the hands, and at the very last we're going to draw a rectangle on top. So we should see rectangles on top of our backgrounds. Let's give it a shot. White background is good. Let's creep our hand in from the back until it gets into view. Any second. There we go. Okay, so in the closest zone, there we go. We see a hand, we move it a little further in, we see green with a red rectangle. This is good. We move it further in, and we get blue with a red rectangle. And that's that. So hopefully throughout this activity you've learned that the setup is run once, draw runs many times per frame. Well, I guess that's once per frame, but many times per second. Draw is processed top to bottom. So as you go, you're stacking layers on top of layers. And how to manipulate this sort of framework that I've set up for you. In the next assignment, you'll be using something similar principles, a little bit of critical thinking. If you need help with that, you can refer back to this video at any time.